Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, April 10th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, have you wished your brother a happy Siblings Day yet?
I have not, because this is the first I'm hearing about it. So thanks for the heads up.
It's a thing. I feel like it's like a bunch of holidays probably came to light for Instagram purposes, right? For social media purposes. So National Siblings Day is a thing now. So I'm going to take this moment to wish my brother Yoni a happy National Siblings Day. Always been very proud to be your older brother.
Aww. So this will be my test to see if my brother listens to this podcast, which I don't think that he does. Scott, happy Siblings Day if you're listening.
Well, I know for a fact my sister-in-law, Emily, listens to it with my nieces every morning. So Emily, pass along to Yoni that I give him a shout out this morning.
Yes, Emily and I have become social media friends. Love Emily.
Jill, apparently in the list of holidays marked for April 10th, today is also National Work From Home Day, which seems like it's a new thing.
Okay, fine, Moshe. I'm not going to come into the office today.
Twist my arm.
So I'm glad you mentioned it, because we actually have a story later in the podcast about how the preferred method of work is actually hybrid, that people want to have a little bit of a mix of being in the office and also working from home. We got a lot in store for you. Jam-packed podcast. Okay, so let's get to it here. The Arizona Supreme Court ruled that an abortion ban dating back to the Civil War could take effect in the state, how it could impact the presidential race. In Michigan, the parents of a school shooter have been sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. The first time parents have been held criminally accountable for their children's actions when it comes to a school shooting. To the environment, just 57 companies are linked to about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions since 2016.
So the headline, you could go ahead and buy a Tesla, but there's a couple dozen real culprits for our climate change issues.
And some new EPA rules take aim at what's known as cancer alleys. In business news, as we were just mentioning, it turns out hybrid workers are the happiest. And TikTok is testing a new Instagram rival. Are photos making a comeback? Moshe, I didn't know they were ever out.
Jill, video is the new thing. Haven't you heard?
I'm still posting still photos with black and white filters.
Sepia. Wasn't the sepia filter? That was big.
Yeah. And why Chechnya is banning music that's either too fast or too slow.
Too fast, straight to jail. Too slow, also straight to jail.
And Bridget Jones and her diary are back. Plus, Moshe's on this day in history.
The Beatles break up, and the Titanic embarks on its maiden voyage on this day in history.
Okay, let's start with an abortion ruling in Arizona. In a 47-page ruling, the state Supreme Court said that Arizona should follow a restrictive abortion law dating back to the 1860s. So this pretty much bans all abortions in the state, except for when the mother's life is in danger. So there are no exceptions for rape or incest. Doctors that perform an abortion face 2 to 5 years in prison. Back in 2022, Arizona passed a law that allowed abortions until the 15th week of pregnancy. But the court on Tuesday ruled that the law did not repeal the 1860 law or create a right to an abortion. Some history here. Back in 1971, Planned Parenthood of Tucson sued the state to overturn that old ban. They lost the case. But that same year was also the year that the U.S. Supreme Court issued its historic Roe v. Wade decision, which basically froze everything in place. And that's where things stood while abortion was legal in this country for about 50 years. But that changed in 2022 when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, notably, yesterday's ruling doesn't immediately go into effect. The state Supreme Court sent it down to a lower court to consider it further. And in her reaction to the ruling, the Attorney General of Arizona, Chris Mays, who is a Democrat, said, quote, "This is far from the end of the debate on reproductive freedom. As long as I am Attorney General, no woman or doctor will be prosecuted under this draconian law in this state." She notes that the law dates back to the Civil War, when Arizona wasn't even a state and when women didn't have the right to vote. Most, the political implications of this decision could be huge. There is already talk of putting abortion on the ballot in November in Arizona. And shortly after the announcement, Vice President Kamala Harris said she was going to be visiting Arizona on Friday.
Yeah, we've said this is a big issue for Democrats, and it took only a few minutes after that ruling for the White House to announce that visit by Vice President Harris later this week. It especially comes in a swing state where Biden only beat Trump there. It's a state Biden only won by about 10,000 votes. 10,000 votes was the margin in 2020. So every vote matters, and the fact that abortion could be on the ballot this fall in a swing state is music to the ears of the Biden campaign, which is struggling right now to connect with younger voters and motivate their voters from 2020 to come out again. Now, as you mentioned, the ban doesn't immediately go into effect. But even if it does later this spring or summer, it does look like Arizona residents will have a chance to vote on a constitutional amendment this fall. Advocates say they've already gotten more than 500,000 signatures for a ballot measure that would codify abortion rights in Arizona. The threshold is about 383,000 in Arizona, so this is more than 100,000 above that. That's key because there's always legal proceedings. They might throw away some signatures if they don't match a voter registration or other documentation in the state. But they feel like they've gotten more than enough to ensure that Arizonans will have a chance to vote on this. Notably, Jill, it's not only Democrats who are criticizing this. There are also a number of Republicans in purple seats, in swing seats in Arizona, who have come out and called this things like a disaster and archaic. Congressman Juan Ciscomani, he's a Republican who represents a seat that Biden won at the presidential level in 2020. He came out, called this a disaster. There's also Congressman David Schweikert. He's another Republican in a district that was won by Biden in 2020. He said that this should be decided by Arizonans. It needs to be addressed immediately. And so you have a number of Republicans here who realize this has gone way too far. It sort of speaks to what we heard from Trump yesterday, who again says this should be in the hand of the states, and they shouldn't go to overly restrictive laws, despite what the far right may say. Though at the same time, Trump says things like Democrats want to abort babies after they're born, which is fundamentally untrue as well. That said, Arizona not alone here. Florida, the Florida Supreme Court also recently allowed that state's 6-week abortion ban to go into effect. That goes into effect in just a couple weeks here. But Florida voters will likely put the issue on the ballot as well in November. So we're going to see up to a dozen states here where it'll be up for a vote. And as we've mentioned before, even in red states like Kentucky, Kansas, Ohio, when abortion's on the ballot, the pro-abortion rights side has won so far in all of the decisions in the last 2 years. And so that is what Kamala Harris later this week is going to help try to ensure for the administration, for the White House, for Democrats. And so it'll be really interesting to see what this election comes down to, Jill, because for Democrats, they very much want to make it about abortion, women's rights, human rights. And for Republicans, they want to make it about inflation, about Biden's record, and of course, about the border and immigration. And so that's a state, Arizona, where all those issues are hyper relevant. So a lot to watch these next 6 months.
Okay, now to Michigan, where James and Jennifer Crumbly, the parents of the teenager who killed 4 fellow students in a school shooting in Oxford, Michigan, were both sentenced on Tuesday to 10 to 15 years in prison. Both had been convicted of manslaughter. Now, this is the first case of its kind where the parents of a school shooter were charged with crimes for their children's actions. The judge, Cheryl Matthews, said the decision should be a deterrent to try to stop school shootings in the future. She said, quote, "Parents are not expected to be psychic, but these convictions are not about poor parenting. These convictions confirm repeated acts or lack of acts that could have halted an oncoming runaway train, about repeatedly ignoring things that would make a reasonable person feel the hair on the back of their neck." Take a listen.
Each of the defendants' gross negligence has caused unimaginable suffering to hundreds of others as a result of what happened that day. Each act or inaction created a ripple effect. Therefore, an out-of-guidelines sentence is appropriate and proportional.
Michigan sentencing guidelines call for a maximum punishment of about 7 years in jail, which prosecutors had said was not enough.
Yeah, the judge was really interesting to listen to on this on Tuesday, Jill. She said this is not about poor parenting, but that they could have, through very simple actions, halted what she called a runaway train here when it comes to their son. This shooting, again, happened back in 2021. That's when Ethan was about 15 years old. He's now 17. He had a separate trial. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Back to the parents here, they ignored several warning signs in the days leading up to the shooting. They had just bought their son the weapon that he used in the shooting. There were text messages exchanged between the mom and the son used in the court proceedings where she effectively laughed off the fact that he was making threats, talking about guns, etc., saying, I'm not mad at you. I just don't want you to get caught. Again, in regards to the threats. Now, what is clear is they had no idea he was actually going to go ahead and murder fellow classmates. But again, the prosecution made the case here, and the judge decided that they could have done more, including securing the weapon and limiting their son's access to it. So a remarkable story here, Jill. Ethan, the son, serving life in prison, and now both parents going away for at least a decade.
Time now for the speed read from Reuters. For all of the talk of things that we could do to stop climate change, a new study finds that a lot of the problem lies with just a few dozen sources. According to a new report, the vast majority of planet warming carbon dioxide emissions over the last decade can be traced to a group of 57 fossil fuel and cement producers. From 2016 to 2022, 57 entities, including state-owned firms and investor-owned companies, produced 80% of the world's CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and cement production. This is according to the Carbon Majors report by the nonprofit think tank Influence Map. So the world's top 3 CO2 emitting companies in the period were state-owned oil firm Saudi Aramco, Russia's state-owned energy giant Gazprom, and the state-owned producer Coal India, which collectively account for about 10% of all emissions globally. Now, during this period, the biggest investor-owned or privately owned contributor to emissions was ExxonMobil of the United States, which was linked to 1.4% of the global total. However, state and state-owned producers were the primary drivers of the emissions surge, especially in the Asian coal sector.
Jill, a lot of takeaways from this report. We linked to it on the Instagram feed, but really, just a couple dozen companies here accounting for the vast majority of the carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere, which is changing our climate. And what they found in this report is that most companies expanded their fossil fuel production since 2016. That's when most of the world agreed on the UN Paris Agreement, committing actions to curb climate change. So since then, while many governments and companies have set tougher emissions targets and rapidly expanded renewable energy, they're also producing and burning more fossil fuels, causing emissions to rise. In fact, CO2 emissions hit a record high last year, according to the International Energy Agency. So it's not just the companies, right? There's a market for what the companies are producing, the state-owned entities especially, and ultimately it's on the countries to change their energy mix and their demand for such things if we're looking to see long-term solutions here.
Sticking with the environment from CNN, the U.S. EPA issued some new rules on Tuesday to protect neighborhoods near more than 200 manufacturing facilities that release airborne toxins like ethylene oxide, chloroprene, benzene, vinyl chloride. The list goes on. According to EPA studies, more than 100,000 Americans live within 6 miles of factories that churn out certain synthetic organic chemicals or use them in the production of polymers. Their risk of cancer from that exposure is above the 1 in 10,000 people mark. That's a threshold that the agency deems to be unacceptably high. Other EPA studies have shown that people living near industrial chemical producers are disproportionately poor and more likely to be Black or brown compared to the general population.
So this new rule cuts the amount of hazardous pollutants these factories allowed to release and substantially reduces the cancer risks from the hazardous airborne pollutants here. The EPA believes that this rule alone will reduce cancer risk by 96% in these communities. For a sense of the geography here, most of the facilities affected by these new rules, Texas, Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast there, as well as the Ohio River Valley and West Virginia. Jill, there's some stark numbers, especially out of Louisiana and Texas, on the health impact of these plants through the years and what it's meant for lifespan, what it's meant for cancer and various diseases in those areas.
From Morning Brew, the biggest chip maker gets billions of dollars for new plants in Arizona. President Biden said this week that the government is planning to give $11.6 billion in grants and loans to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co., that is the world's top chip maker, to support the construction of a third factory in Phoenix, Arizona. 2 were already planned.
Yeah, this has been a big push for the administration to build up capacity here at home. So you have the Taiwanese here building a plant in Arizona. Alert, alert, it's an election year, and that's a swing state, and that creates jobs. So another big thing they're pushing in the state of Arizona, it's one of the largest awards yet under the 2022 CHIPS and Science Act. That was a signature piece of legislation here for Biden. He's trying to push it. And again, it's key in a state that he narrowly won in 2020.
From the BBC, TikTok is looking to take on Instagram by launching a separate photo sharing app. The company said it was working on a dedicated space for images and text. Some users have received notifications saying that their photo posts will be shared to a new TikTok Notes app unless they opt out.
That's creative, TikTok Notes.
Everyone just copies each other. And for real, it is the latest example of social media firms imitating each other's products, including Instagram launching Reels, a TikTok-like video tool back in 2020. One analyst tells the BBC the copycat phenomenon runs rampant across social media platforms. TikTok says that it hasn't finalized the design of the Notes app, nor has it confirmed a release date, but notifications received by some users suggest that the app will let users upload or share photo posts, which are currently a feature of the TikTok app, and let people post a series of images with sounds and filters.
I have a proposal for TikTok. Why don't they just call it PicTok? Do you like that name?
I love that.
If it's photos, it should be PicTok. So it's like TikTok for video, PicTok for photos. Just saying, you can hire me at TikTok. I have ideas. But then again, that might get me banned depending on this legislation that is going through Congress.
Moshe, Instagram is your bread and butter. Let's not mess with it.
No, but if that's true. As they say in digital parlance, it's our top of the funnel. It's where we bring people in, Jill, and then bring them to the podcast and bring them to the newsletter and maybe one day bring them to our TikTok page. Though that's always our challenge. You know, we do a lot with text and photos on Instagram, and TikTok is very much a video platform. So we have about 20,000 followers on TikTok, but we haven't grown as much there. I got to be doing more. We all need to be doing more in terms of video over there. That said, as you mentioned, the copycat phenomenon, I was just thinking about this. So you mentioned that, you know, Instagram developed Reels as a copycat of TikTok. If you go further back, Instagram developed Stories as a copycat of Snapchat. And if you go further back in the meta world, Facebook was a copycat of MySpace and Friendster. So no matter where you go, you know, imitation is effectively the way to create. So no matter what social media you're thinking about, it's always a version of this. It's always a copy of that. Can you do it better? Can you grow faster? And I am curious about TikTok, that's what I'm calling it now, whether because that algorithm is so good on TikTok when it comes to video, if there's going to be a chance to pull people away. You know, for a hot second there, Jill, remember when we were threading for like a day or two?
Do you still thread?
Once in a while, I'll go to Threads. We have like 75,000 followers or 80,000 followers on Threads. It's the meta version of Twitter, right? And so we were threading for like a hot second, and then we stopped the thread. Now, I know there's still some people on the Threads, but the big question will be, when they launch this, will it bring in a whole influx of people, but will they stay? So that's one of the questions here in this multi-front war here between Instagram and TikTok, where one takes the other's concept. And in this case, they're launching a rival. We'll see what happens. We'll see what this also means to, again, the ongoing legislation about a Chinese-owned company owning a very influential social media platform here in the U.S.
Well, that's the whole thing about existing social media companies spinning off on different apps, because they already are going to bring basically their whole user base. As they say with TikTok, you have to opt out. So everybody who's on TikTok is basically going to automatically be on Notes. Whether they use it or not is the other question.
Well, that was the excitement with Threads, right? That Threads was connected to Instagram. And so you still see it on Instagram. You see the little Thread logo and like anyone who's on Threads, you can like connect to their Threads page. Again, apologies if you follow us on Threads. I don't frequently update there, but I aspire to with all our extra time here at Mo.news.
I was going to say, good luck with that. Let me know how it goes. Okay, from Axios, for the first time since the pandemic, more workers prefer hybrid work arrangements than fully remote setups. That is according to a new report. Hybrid work is emerging as the clear winner in the post-pandemic work world. And that is a bit of a surprise from a few years ago when it seemed like a fully at-home revolution was underway. Hybrid workers are apparently happier. Their engagement with work increased in 2024 from the previous year, while it fell for those that are fully in person or fully at home. This is according to Morning Consult, which has been surveying workers on the topic since 2022. This conversation, though, is mainly confined to white-collar knowledge workers, as they're called. Most people in general still work in person, although that doesn't mean that they like it. Morning Consult surveyed 3,389 employed adults in January, and the vast majority, 65%, work in person, but only 46% preferred to work in person.
I don't know how I feel about them calling it white-collar knowledge workers. I mean, I guess they're trying to delineate between physical labor and knowledge, like intellectual, but at the same time, no, it's not a good, no, at the same time, like it requires knowledge to do things with your body, or anyway, needless to say, guys, back to the drawing board.
Teachers are not knowledge workers.
Correct. So we're going to refrain from using that term, despite the fact that our good friends at Axios used it in their story there. Back to the drawing board for those terms. That said, no big surprise here. This is sort of like Goldilocks, right? You don't want your porridge too hot. You don't want your porridge too cold. So hybrid work feels right, where you get your office presence, but you also get to work at home maybe on Mondays and Fridays for sort of a longer weekend, right? And so now you see, according to this study, that they asked U.S. adults if they feel engaged while working. 92% felt most engaged as a hybrid worker, 89% among in-person workers, and then 86% among fully remote workers, which is actually an interesting argument that you've heard from some CEOs saying that we do see a lack of engagement from fully remote workers. So it seems like we're going to find this reasonable middle here. People want flexibility. Again, it's contingent on your job being able to afford you flexibility, because not all jobs allow you to be able to work from your kitchen counter, living room, couch, or home office if you have one of those.
I could tell you personally, Moshe, if our office was a little bit more convenient and the timing worked, because we do record the podcast at night, I like going into the office, and I especially would like it 3 days a week. You know, that sounds about right.
Jill's advocating for the moving of the Mo.news headquarters further east.
Queens? Are you open to Queens?
Let's discuss.
From The Guardian, the Russian Republic of Chechnya has banned dance music that it deems either too fast or too slow in an attempt to quash a, quote, polluting Western influence on the conservative majority Muslim region. The culture minister saying, quote, all musical, vocal, and choreographic work should correspond to a tempo of 80 to 116 beats per minute, as a way to make sure that it conforms to the Chechen mentality and sense of rhythm. He said, borrowing musical culture from other peoples is inadmissible. We must bring to the people and to the future of our children the cultural heritage of the Chechen people. Now, according to reports in Russian media, artists in the region have a deadline of June 1st to rewrite any music that doesn't conform to this new rule.
Jill, this is one of those headlines that felt like too crazy to be true. And yet it is. It's like ripped from like the plot of Footloose, kind of.
Moshe, on that point, you actually texted to the group text that we use for the podcast saying, Jill, make sure to include the Chechnya too fast, too slow music story. And I was like, what in the heck are you talking about? I had to Google it because in my wildest dreams, I couldn't figure out what this one was about.
So this law, in effect, criminalizes most modern dance music that are typically played in clubs around the world. House, techno, drum and bass. Those are all over 110 beats a minute. So is most disco, by the way, if you want to do throwback. At the same time, it appears most hip hop and rap would fall between this 70 would fall between this 80 to 116 beats a minute. So I guess in theory would qualify for the Chechen sense of rhythm here that the regime of the authoritarian leader in Chechnya wants to preserve. A reminder, Chechnya is in the North Caucasus region of Eastern Europe, and they've had a number of issues. Even as we joke about this music issue, there have been major issues when it comes to human rights abuses, the violent persecution of sexual minorities. The Chechen government claims there are no gay people in the country, as they have a number of bans in place for the LGBT community. So serious issues happening there, but at the same time, authoritarian leaders sort of going overboard here when it comes to literally counting the number of beats in a song. And Jill, I checked the Footloose theme song, too fast for Chechnya.
I'm not surprised.
They couldn't play it there.
And finally, from People magazine, Bridget Jones and her diary are back. Universal Pictures says Renée Zellweger will star in Bridget Jones' Mad About the Boy, the fourth movie in the Bridget Jones series. Zellweger got her first Academy Award nomination for Bridget Jones' Diary back in 2001. Hugh Grant is expected to reprise his role from the series as Daniel Cleaver, but no word yet on Colin Firth as Mark Darcy, my favorite.
What we do know is Emma Thompson, who co-wrote and appeared in the Bridget Jones' Baby movie back in 2016, will also be returning for this film. This film expected to be released next Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2025. Jill, admission here, I've never watched any of the Bridget Jones' Diary films.
Well, a good thing that we balance each other out, Moshe, because I have seen Bridget Jones' Diary no less than 1,000 times. So
stay tuned, folks. Next February, Jill will have live breaking coverage. Think about the total eclipse and bring it to Bridget Jones, and Jill will have that for you on this podcast.
Challenge accepted.
All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1912. A little ship by the name of the Titanic embarked on its maiden voyage on this day. It would end in tragedy, as we all know, 4 days later, since we've decided, Jill, to give away the plot of Titanic on this podcast, when it struck an iceberg and sank. There's actually a spot. If you come to New York City, I was doing tours for a little bit during COVID, of the west side of Manhattan. And there is a spot along the Hudson River where you can still visit the place where the Titanic was supposed to arrive. They had a special dock built 110 plus years ago to accommodate the size of the Titanic, given how large it was at that point. So there's a little plaque there, and it shows you where the Titanic would have docked if it had made it all the way. All right, a happy 99th birthday to The Great Gatsby. On this day in 1925, F. Scott Fitzgerald's book, The Great Gatsby, was released. There's your Long Island shout out, Jill.
The Gold Coast of Long Island, Moshe, the glory days.
A good home for the mo.news headquarters one day.
Yes.
Someone has said. Fast forward to the 1970s. On this date in 1971, you might have seen this in Forrest Gump, but this is based on reality. A table tennis team from the U.S. arrived in China at the invitation of the communist government for a goodwill visit that came to be known as ping pong diplomacy. So that was one of the many things being done in the 1970s to start to open up the relationship between the U.S. and China. All right, some pop culture here. On this day in 1970, 54 years ago today, the Beatles officially broke up. Now, this didn't come as much of a surprise. It had been rumored for months. The Beatles were not getting along. Those headlines were out there. There's other histories that say that Lennon had actually quit the group in 1969, a year before this, but had kept it secret for business reasons. Well, why does today matter? Because April 10th, 1970, Paul McCartney officially, publicly announced he was leaving the Beatles. It's still incredible when you pull up Beatles classics, Beatles songs, Jill, the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of hits of familiar songs that they wrote and performed in that, period of time that they were actually together.
It really is. Malcolm Gladwell in The Outliers talks about the Beatles and how they spent, before they became famous, the famous 10,000 hours practicing together, which is partly, he would argue, why they were able to just crank out so many hits.
Yeah, a decade. They were literally together for almost exactly 10 years and were able to put out those hits, but also just the variety of music they were putting out. And we end here with one other musical item. 25 years ago today, a quarter century old today, TLC's No Scrubs. Jill, there's also the lesser known offshoot of that, No Pigeons. Do you remember No Pigeons?
No, are you being serious?
It was the counter song to No Scrubs, because No Scrubs is about men.
So then there was men made one.
And then there was a rap group that put together No Pigeons about women.
I thought you were kidding.
No. I remember downloading it on Napster. There you go. That was the time.
And hopefully your computer didn't crash.
Oh, I'm sure it did. I'm sure I got several viruses as I tried to find that song.
All right. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
And make sure to check out our brother podcast on National Siblings Day. Since we both have brothers, Jill. The Mo News, the interview. We have a new interview up there right now, another one coming out later this week. So definitely check out our interviews podcast, almost 80 conversations over there on a whole variety of subjects. And so if you're looking to do a deep dive into anything from NASA to UFOs to politics to the state to parenting to foreign policy, we have it all there for you on Mo News, the interview. So go check that out on your podcast feed. And one more plug before we go. Check out our newsletter today, where we delve into 30-something and 40-something mothers, an increasingly popular phenomenon. They used to be called 35 plus geriatric, which is not kind medical profession, as somebody who gave birth to 2 babies after I was 35. But there are some benefits, as we're learning, to having children later in life. Yeah, new trend line. Officially now, the majority of babies in America are born to moms over the age of 30 for the first time. So make sure to subscribe if you don't already to the Mo newsletter over at mo.news/newsletter. All right. Bye, everyone. Later.